Welcome to section 2.3, characteristics of developing countries. So, in this section, we're just going to be going through some sort of common characteristics that a lot of developing countries share. And that's not to say that every single developing country has these characteristics. They're just something that we see in a lot of these countries. So, to start off, we just want to talk a little bit about income inequality. In the next module, we're going to talk more about, sort of whether inequality is efficient or inefficient, or how much inequality is too much inequality. But here we're just going to document the presence of a lot of inequality, both between countries and within countries. So, first off, if we take a look at inequality between countries, what I've got here is shares of global income. So, if we added up all the GDP in the whole world and we apportioned it by region, in 1970, you can see that high income countries had about 61% of total income, and the rest was sort of distributed. East Asia had about 3%, the Middle East, North Africa, 1%. Europe, sort of not counting these high income countries in Europe, had about 26%. Latin America, about 5%. Sub Saharan Africa, 2%. South Asia, 2%. If we fast forward to 2018, the last year for which we have reliable data, you can see the share that's going to high income countries actually gone down. So, actually, between country inequality appears to have gone down a little bit, but not every region has done as well or grown as quickly. You can see, tremendous growth in East Asia, going from about 3% of global income to 15% of global income, so a five-time increase. The Middle East has gone up a little bit, gone from 1% to about 3%. Europe's share has gone down a bit. Latin America's had some sort of modest growth. South Asia's had some modest growth. And Sub-Saharan Africa seems to be sort of stuck, not necessarily doing any worse because overall income has gone up. So they are certainly doing a little bit better, but certainly not growing at nearly the same pace as some of these other regions of the world. And then there's a lot of inequality within countries, and certainly a lot of poverty within countries. And so here, what I've got here is a couple of groupings of countries, sort of high income countries, upper middle income countries, lower middle income, and least developed countries, the lowest income countries. And what you see here is basically the share of income that's going to the top percent of earners in that country and the share that goes to the bottom 10% in that country. Now, if we take the ratio of this, the decile ratio is what this is called. Basically, this tells us how much more income, the richest 10% have as compared to the poorest 10%. So, for example, in Norway, the richest 10% have about 6 times more money than the poorest 10%. And that's actually one of the most equal countries in the world. If we go look at the UK, it's about 8. And then in the US, the richest 10% have about 18 times more income than the poorest 10%. Now, certainly a lot of differences within that high income group. But then if we start looking at developing countries, we see some really stark levels of income inequality. So South Africa, for example, where the richest 10% have 57 times more income than the poorest 10%. If we go down to Haiti, already a very poor country, the richest 10% in Haiti have 80 times more income than the poorest 10%. So on average, we tend to see more inequality in developing countries, but even within sort of income groups, there's a lot of variation. So, in this upper middle income group, you have a country like Thailand, which has a relatively low level of inequality. In this lower middle income group, you have a country like Ukraine, which has even less inequality, for example, than Norway. And then Nepal, for example, has a lot less inequality, certainly than Haiti, in that lowest income group. So, we don't want to say all developing countries have high levels of inequality, but on average, we do observe more inequality in developing countries. Now, if we also look at poverty, certainly what we observe here is that the countries that have a lot of inequality tend to also have a lot of poverty. And so, the poorest people in the poorest countries are a lot worse off than the poorest people in the richest countries. And so, for example, if we take a look at the World Bank's definition of absolute poverty, if you're earning less than $1.90 a day, you can see, for example, in South Africa, about 17% of the population is classified as in absolute poverty as compared to, for example, Thailand, where almost nobody's in absolute poverty. Now, if you take a look at the national poverty line, so this is sort of for that country, who is earning below an income level where they're meeting their basic needs. Obviously, these percentages are larger, but still we see much higher levels of poverty in the most unequal countries. Okay, moving on. Where did we get inequality from? And this is a, sort of a really interesting question. Is inequality just like a natural sort of thing of our sort of modern economy? Are we, as a species, sort of, guaranteed to have an unequal society where some have more than others? Now you can think about it, if you're more productive than somebody else, then yeah, you should earn more. If you work harder than somebody else, you should earn more. But how much inequality is too much inequality? So we're going to spend a lot more time going through that in the next module, but it's useful to kind of look at sort of the history of inequality. We're going to go way back to about 2 million to 10,000 years ago, where this is really most of human history. And so we're mostly living in hunter gatherer societies. And it turned out that actually sharing was an evolutionary advantage. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that you're in one of these hunter gatherer societies and you go out on a hunt, right? And so you're real successful. You bring home, woolly mammoth and you bring it back to your tribe. And let's say that you decide you're going to be selfish. You're like, nobody else helped me out with this hunt. I did it all myself. Why should I share with you? You didn't do any of the work. Okay. The problem with that is that the next time you go out hunting, let's say you're not successful, you come back, you're hungry, everybody's going to remember that you were selfish the last time that you were successful, and they're not going to share with you. So if you were magnanimous, if you were sharing your hunt with other people when you were successful, that's going to make them more likely to share with you when you're not successful. So in fact, sharing was a way to sort of diversify risk. And it's likely that the people that were more sort of genetically inclined to be equitable, to be sharing, uh, more likely to survive. They passed on their genes. And in fact, the selfish people probably died out at a higher rate. And so there's something to be said about sort of this notion of fairness and equity being sort of genetically hardwired into us, sort of like a biological, evolutionary economic sort of explanation there. And in fact, we have this sort of visceral reaction when we see something that's unfair, when somebody has more than another person and they didn't earn it, right? That makes us feel, bad about that. And I think, there's something to be said about maybe that's, a legacy of when we were living in these hunter-gatherer societies. Because again, that's most of human history. I mean, 10,000 years forward, and we're going to talk about it, they mention agriculture in a second here, is maybe not enough time for, sort of that, sharing gene to have been selected out. Now, in these hunter-gatherer societies, there was very little inequality within groups. There was a little bit of inequality between groups. Some had better hunting foraging grounds, but not much, right? So we didn't really observe a lot of inequality. Now, that's not to say that these societies were well off. I mean, life expectancy was like 30, 35 years at best. Very poor. And things improved a lot for everybody with the invention of agriculture about 10,000 years ago. But the invention of agriculture did lead to a big increase in inequality within societies. So, invention of agriculture, people stay in one place. So now all of a sudden, who owns the land now becomes an important thing. If you own, for example, the silo in which grain is being stored, or you own the plow that is being used to farm, now if you have land, if you have capital, you're going to have a lot more wealth than somebody, for example, who relies purely on their labor, and especially more than even slaves, for example, who don't even own their own labor. So you have a lot more inequality within societies. Now you have a little bit of between in society inequality. You have the formation of the First Nation states. Some states are richer than others. Some have better agricultural productivity. They're just blessed to have that land that is a little bit more productive. But by and large, there's not a lot of inequality between countries. The vast majority of inequality that we observe is within countries. Those who have land and capital are much better off than those who don't. Now, people, even those that don't own any land or capital, they are still better off than they were under hunter-gatherer society. So, life expectancy goes up. People are now getting enough to eat. There is a lot more inequality, but overall, everybody's better off. Now, fast forward a little bit to the modern era, and you have sort of the Enlightenment, you have the Industrial Revolution, and really what you have is an explosion of new technologies. And it turns out that a lot of the technologies that came out were what we call skill biased, meaning that they increase the productivity of capital, they increase the productivity of skilled workers a lot more than they did for unskilled labor. So this magnified the inequality within countries, certainly for those who had education, for those who owned capital. They saw vast increases in their wealth, but it also led to a big increase in inequality between countries because some countries were able to utilize the new technologies that were developed because they had abundant capital, they had abundant skilled labor. Other countries that lacked these resources were not able to utilize this technology. And in fact, this inequality has continued to worsen over time. This between country inequality has gotten worse over time. And the reason for it is if you think about most of the technology that is being developed in rich countries, and it's being developed to solve rich country problems. So most rich countries have abundant capital and relatively scarce labor. And so if you think about, for example, automation, right? You're replacing workers with machinery. So that's great if you're owning capital, and that is a way certainly to increase profits, increase productivity. But if you look at a country, for example, like Bangladesh, which has very little capital but a lot of labor, labor is really cheap in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is not going to benefit from automation at all because they've got a lot of really cheap workers and capital is really expensive. So why would they ever want to replace really cheap workers with expensive capital, right? So the kind of technologies that are being developed are benefiting rich countries a lot more than they are poor countries. So poor countries need to develop technologies that take advantage of the resources that they are abundant in. So you need to come up with things that replace, for example, capital with labor. An example of this is a big tangent, but if you think about how an iPhone is built, so when you build an iPhone, it's built in China, uh, where labor is abundant. So capital is relatively scarce, labor is abundant. You could think about building an iPhone, for example, with some automated production line where the robots are doing everything. But in fact, that's not how it's built, right? An iPhone is assembled by a whole bunch of labor, each person doing a little tiny thing. And so, the companies that are assembling the iPhones or a whole bunch of other technologies have figured out a way to take advantage of relatively cheap labor and actually replace a lot of capital with labor. So that's an example of a technology that would benefit a developing country. Okay, so we've been talking a little bit about skills, and really what we're talking about here is human capital. So human capital is different from physical capital in the sense that human capital represents sort of knowledge, right? It's the set of skills and know-how used in the production of output. So it's examples being literate, knowing how to use a computer, speaking a foreign language, knowing human anatomy, knowing how to repair a car. All of these are examples of human capital. So the more human capital somebody has, the more productive they're going to be, and the more income they're going to earn. As you increase the level of human capital in a country, that country's productivity goes up and their GDP goes up. And should be that their standard of living will rise as well. What we observe is much lower levels of human capital in developing countries. So here, if we look at income classifications, a couple of different examples of human capital, you can see that in high income countries, a lot more kids are enrolled in primary school. So almost all children of primary school age in high income countries are enrolled. Contrast that to low income countries where it's still not bad. It's a lot better than it used to be. But 2 out of every 10 kids that should be in primary school aren't in low income countries. Now, the quality of education matters as well. Now, part of that's going to be the pupil to teacher ratio. So, in high income countries, there's about 15 students for every teacher. In low income countries, it's about 43 students for every teacher. Now, good teachers can do fine with a large class, but on average, put the same teacher in a small class and a large class, you're going to get better results with the small class. There's more attention for each student, especially at the primary level. Other examples of this, if we look at, for example, technology diffusion. So this is the number of broadband internet users per 100. In low-income countries, we're only talking like 6%. In high-income countries, like 81%. So huge differences there. And then we can think of health, too, as an example of human capital. The healthier you are, the more productive you're going to be. And so, for example, 8% of kids under the age of 5 in low-income countries are expected to die is less than 1% in high-income countries. And we see this repeated if we look across regions as well. And you can see, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, really low primary enrollment ratios, really high pupil to teacher ratios, low internet penetration, really high rates of child mortality. And so these are just other ways to look at development in a country, and it really represents potential, right? So a country that has really good indicators for education, really good indicators for health, that's a country we should expect to grow pretty quickly, right? Even if their income's not that high, if they've got those good indicators, that means that the future population is going to be really productive. And if they can find jobs, right? If the institutions in that country, the infrastructure in that country is set up for them to be gainfully employed, to be able to utilize their talents, then we should see that country really grow pretty quickly. So the next thing I want to look at is population growth. Now, the majority of the world's population lives in developing countries. A lot of people, think, oh, there's not that many people in developing countries. Actually, about 5 out of 6 people in the world live in developing countries. And in fact, this is something that's likely to, become even more extreme over time, given that the fastest rates of population growth are, in fact, in the poorest countries. Now, this places a pretty big burden on education and health systems. If you think, You've got a lot of very young people. You have very young populations. You need to educate them. There's a lot of health costs associated with childbirth. There's a lot of health costs associated with young children. And a lot of these countries have already strained education and health systems, and fast rates of population growth are just going to exacerbate the strain on those countries. And so this is data from the UN that takes a look at population projections. So the actual population numbers in 1950, 2000, and then projections for 2050, 2100, and a ridiculous projection for 2300. But what you see here is that if we look at 1950, for example, and then look at, for example, the top 10 populated countries. So you have China, India, the US, top three. That doesn't change even in the projections. But then you have Russia, Japan, Indonesia, Germany, Brazil, UK. So you got some developed countries, in that top 10. And if you go a little bit further, you got Italy, France, so on and so forth. If we fast forward to 2050, you can see that, the top 10, the US is the only country that really shows up there. Maybe China will be, high income by 2050, probably will be actually. But, what you see right now is the countries, especially if we project out even further, 2100, you can see the fastest growing countries are some of the poorest countries in the world. And so the vast majority of the world's population are living in developing countries. Now, this is sort of explained by looking at something called a dependency ratio. We're going to look at dependency ratios in both poor and rich countries. So we'll look at two kinds of them. One is youth dependency. So youth dependency is basically the fraction of the population. So it's the number of people that are under the age of 15 divided by the number of people that are between 15 and 64. So it gives you a sense of basically how many young people are being supported by each person that's of working age. Old age dependency is the number of people in a country that are 65 and older divided by the number of people that are 15 to 64. So that's the number of old people that are being supported by the working age population. So if we take a look at dependency ratios across countries, and I've got some developing countries, I've got some developed countries, and let's take a look at 1970, for example. So the total dependency ratio, basically you just add up the old age and the youth together. And what we see here is that for the developing countries, it's all youth dependency, right? I mean, there's a little bit of old age dependency, but it's almost all youth dependency. So Mexico, for example, in 1970, there's almost a 1-to-1 ratio of people under 15 to people of working age 15 to 64. Right? And we see this repeated for a lot of these developing countries. Now, if we take a look at some of these richer countries, for example, we look at Sweden, Japan, those bottom two rows, you can see much higher rates of old age dependency. Now, fast forward to 2015, and what you see is big reductions for some countries in their youth dependency ratio. So Mexico goes from 94% youth dependency down to 42%. Philippines goes from 87% to 50%. Brazil from 78 to 33. So why has the youth dependency ratio fallen so much for some of these countries? The simple explanation is fertility rates have gone way down. So in 1970, the gross fertility rate in Mexico was almost like 7 kids, per woman. It's, almost below 3 right now. So huge drops in fertility rates. And then if we look at these, developed countries, we look at Sweden, we look at Japan, you see massive increases in old age dependency. Right? So Japan's old age dependency ratio goes from 10% in 1970 all the way up to 43% in 2015. So the reason why youth dependency has been falling in developing countries, not all of them, but most of them, has been big drops in fertility rates. In the countries where it hasn't fallen, the fertility rate hasn't gone down. And then the reason why old age dependency has gone up in rich countries, and in fact, it's gone up in developing countries too, has been basically improvements in health technology. People are living longer. So this presents a bit of a dilemma, right? And an opportunity too. So if you take a look at a country like Mexico, where somebody born today, somebody who's, let's say, 15 today, is probably not going to have nearly as many kids as their parents did. And so they're not going to have to support as many children as their parents did. So if they enter into the labor force and they start earning income, then even if they're making just the same amount of money as their parents did, that money's going to go further because they don't have as many children to take care of. So they can invest more in each child's education, they can invest more in themselves, they can save more, which leads to more capital accumulation in that country. And that's a potential, what we call demographic dividend. However, it also creates enormous strain on labor markets. So you're going to have a lot of young people that are entering into the labor force in a lot of developing countries. So if you think about 70s, 80s, 90s, really when fertility rates started to go down, a lot of those people are now entering into the labor force. So it's a big youth bulge, is what you call it. And they're starting to, become adults now. They're starting to enter the labor force. If they can't find jobs, and this presents a massive problem, you have a lot of youth unemployment that can be really politically destabilizing. A lot of young people that did everything that they were supposed to do, and they still can't find work. Now, you also have developed countries that have aging populations, big increases in old age population. This is a huge strain on pension systems like Social Security, a huge strain on health systems like Medicare. And basically, those kinds of systems rely upon people working right now to pay for the benefits of people retired. So it could be a potential solution. Why not increase immigration from developing countries that have a lot of young people that want to work to developed countries that need more workers? There's a lot to unwrap there. There's obviously a lot of arguments against increasing migration, but certainly this was one potential, sort of symbiotic relationship where you could ease the strain on developing country labor markets, and you could certainly help to fund, a lot of the health and pension systems in developed countries. Again, a whole bunch of other, arguments for and against that we unfortunately don't have the time to get into. If you are interested, take my course, Econ 381, Economics of Immigration in the fall. But something to think about. Okay. The next thing we want to look at is a notion called ethno-linguistic fractionalization, very fancy term. But basically, what we're talking about here is a lot of developing countries have, a lot of different ethnic groups, linguistic groups, religious groups, etc. Right? And basically, the reason why is a lot of developing countries did not have borders that sort of formed organically, that were, groups of people that shared a common, sort of ideology about how they want to be governed, forming a country together. Rather, a lot of developing countries were formed by the stroke of a pen after, a big world war, where the former colonial powers decided to sort of draw lines on a map and figure out, what their former colonies were going to become. And so a lot of the times that grouped together a bunch of groups that didn't always get along. Now, this isn't to say that diversity is a bad thing. It can be a really great thing, right? So there's a lot of benefits from having a lot of diversity in terms of ethnicity, languages, religion, whatever. Certainly multiple points of view and different ways of doing things can be better than just having one way to do things. You can try different things out. If you have a lot of diversity, you have a lot of people interacting with each other, then this can lead to better understanding of the differences between them, of the needs of one group versus another, and potentially you could actually reduce the chance of external conflict, right? So if you've got, two countries, side by side, and they share a lot of common, ethnicities or languages, maybe there's better understanding between those countries, and they're less likely to get into conflict with each other. Furthermore, if you have a whole bunch of different groups in a country, no one group maybe is able to rule by themselves, and so they're forced to rule by consensus, right? Maybe that leads for them to become more democratic, more stable. Okay, that's a lot of potential, could be good. But there are a lot of costs too. There's a lot of potential for problems. So it's certainly much harder to reach a governing consensus when you have a whole bunch of different groups all wanting different things, right? And so you can make compromises, but I mean, think about it. If you're making plans to go out to dinner with your friends, knock on wood, we can go do that again soon. If it's just you and like one other person, that's easy, right? But if like you're trying to make plans for 20 people to meet at dinner, good luck trying to do that. That's a nightmare. Uh, Furthermore, what we oftentimes will observe, especially in non-democratic states, is that the government is sort of from one particular group, and a bunch of the other groups end up being marginalized. So they're not represented in the government, and these groups that are on the outs, oftentimes, because they feel marginalized, they feel that there's no sort of political path to achieving their goals. They might choose conflict as the means of achieving their goals and taking power. So there's a bigger chance of internal conflict, and then also there's a bigger chance of external conflict too. So again, if you've got two countries side by side, and let's say you've got two different ethnicities that are in both countries, in country A, let's say that ethnicity one is dominant, ethnicity two is marginalized. In country B, let's say, that the ethnicity two, the marginalized one in the first country, is dominant themselves. Well, the minority group in the first country might want to secede and go into that second country. And so this could lead to an external conflict if that actually happens. Now, what's the empirical evidence on this? It's really mixed. You have some countries, the US, for example, where you have a lot of diversity, it seems to be effective. On the other hand, you have other countries where there is a tremendous amount of diversity. It's really been the cause of a lot of the conflict that's going on. I mean, you just look at Syria right now, what's going on, or you look at Iraq, the whole notion of sectarian conflict. Uh, it doesn't mean that there had to be a war, but certainly there's a potential for such a thing to occur. Okay, so that was the last slide there. I'm back. Anyways, that is the last part of this section. In section 2.4, we're going to start taking a look at a few other issues, things like adverse geography, disease, colonial legacies, the influence of international organizations, and then the question of whether or not developing countries are catching up. All right. Hope you enjoyed it. See you soon.